Good day, everyone. Of course, I'm John Corstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center here at the Mariners Museum and Park. And it's my pleasure to tell you all today what I consider to be one of the most unique stories of ships during the Civil War, and that has to be the CSS Nashville. What makes the Nashville so important, in my opinion, and it has a very short timeline, is that number one, it was able to go in and out of the blockade several times, 5 total, and so that's pretty significant for any ship. Number two, it is the first ship to be recognized in an English port flying the Confederate flag, which is that time is known as the Stars and Bars. And so that's makes that pretty significant. It was all wrapped up in the Trent Affair, which we'll talk about later today, and about how Great Britain tried to utilize their act of neutrality, which they were prompted to do at the beginning of the Civil War. The Nashville itself was also part of other ships. The Nashville will be eventually bought by Fraser Trenholm and Company of Liverpool and Charleston, and they turn it into a blockade runner known as the Thomas L. Ragg. They had several successful voyages, but then it's going to become the privateer known as the Rattlesnake, and sadly it will be not sadly, it will be destroyed by actually John Lomer Worden and the USS Montauk. Now today I'm not going to talk about the Nashville as the Rattlesnake, because in January I'm going to tell the complete story of Worden and the Montauk and its attacks on Fort McAllister, as well as the destruction, what they would have called the Nashville. So anyway, the Nashville was built as a fast screw steamer constructed by William Collier of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and was launched on September 22nd, 1853. Now, it was commissioned as a U.S. mail steamer, and that gave it an official position as being assigned a special run. In this case, the Nashville is going to go from New York to Charleston. It's kind of called a packet. In other words, they have regular service that is pretty well on time. And so this ship is amazing what they did. You know, it's 1,200 tons. It's got a 215.6 foot length. Its beam was 34.6 feet, and its draft was 21.9. That's a little much for southern waters. Nevertheless, it could make 14.5 knots, which makes it superior to most vessels then operating at the beginning of the Civil War. She had a side lever engine with 2 boilers, all built at Novelty Iron Works in New York. The Nashville also, as you can see, was bark rigged, but it really relied more on its engines than anything else. Now, it's been taking this run since 1853, and all of a sudden, it comes down to Charleston on April 11th, 1861. And you know what's about to happen there. The Confederates have surrounded Fort Charleston with batteries, Fort Moultrie, and Cummings Point, and so forth, and they're demanding its surrender. Gustavus Vasa Fox had organized a relief expedition to come down, so a bunch of Union ships are sitting off the bar of the entrance to Charleston Harbor, when all of a sudden here comes the Nashville churning quickly to make its entrance. And the paddlers noted, oh my gosh, what are all these ships doing here? And so then the Harriet Lane, then United States Revenue Cutter Service, Harriet Lane, will actually come towards the vessel, and it fires a shot at the Nashville, which skips in front of the ship, and the Nashville runs up the American flag. The Harriet Lane does so, and the Nashville just continues to go into the harbor, shows up in docks, and it's going to be captured. So that shot is the first naval shot of the Civil War. So there's another great first for the Nashville. Now, the Nashville is going to be transformed into a warship by Lieutenant Robert Baker Pegram. Now, Pegram's an FFV, First Families of Virginia. He had served he joined the Navy in 1829 as a midshipman. He will serve during the Mexican War under David Glasgow Farragut, and he actually participates in Matthew Galbraith's Perry voyage to Japan. So in 1855, he's going to be in command of the Powhatan in the East India Squadron, where along with the HMS Rattler in the Pearl River, they will break up a whole fleet of Chinese pirates. This is during the Second Opium War. And so when he comes back to the United States, he's considered a great hero, and actually the Commonwealth of Virginia are going to give him a silver presentation sword. Pretty amazing. Now, he also goes on the Paraguay expedition, but really he's one of the men on the ground when Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth, Virginia, is going to be abandoned by the United States. And it is Pigram that will come in, take over the yard, amidst all the ashes and ruins. Actually, he ascertains that, look, this yard is still in great shape. They did not destroy it properly. The Grand Dry Dock still works. So that was really pretty positive. Pigram is very, very dynamic. He will then, a new commander of the Gosport Navy Yard will come down, French Forest. He will then build maybe many naval officers at the beginning of the Civil War. Remember, the Confederacy did not have a Navy to start with. They have all these naval officers that go south. So Pigram will build a series of fortifications, batteries, at what is known as Pig Point. Now, Pig Point is overlooking the entrance to the Nansmouth River at what's called the Nansmouth Road. It's a corner of Hampton Roads, and as a result of that, he will actually engage, believe it or not, one ship known as the Harriet Lane. He chases the Harriet Lane away because they actually have fairly good cannon. So Pigram then is going to be assigned to Charleston, and he will be given the job of preparing the Nashville for a very important voyage. You have to see that the Confederacy wanted to use King Cotton as a way to ensure the recognition by foreign powers, particularly England and France, to recognize the Confederacy. Ergo, they could help break the blockade, and the Southern Confederacy, without that blockade, may have been able to survive. It's hard. I don't like to speculate as a historian, but nevertheless, they have. So what the Confederate government wants to do is send two envoys over to England or Great Britain and France. One is going to be known, of course, as James Mason. The other one's John Seidel. Mason's from Virginia. Seidel is from Louisiana. And so they say, we're going to use the Nashville because it's so fast to take these envoys safely to Great Britain. And so the Nashville gets armed with two brass British 6-pounder guns. Now, there's some speculation. If you read my blog, you'll note all these other people are saying 12-pounders. Well, from the word of the mouth of the very man that armed the ship, he said 6-pounder. That's Robert Pegram. Now, despite the orders for these envoys to go on board the Nashville, they decide, that's kind of risky. And what we really want to do is run out of the Charleston on board a fast blockade runner, at once known as the Gordon. Then it was renamed the Theodora, and they will go down to Cuba. Thence in Cuba, they had wanted to then book passage on a British steamer, a mail steamer in particularly, to go to Great Britain. They would be protected then, rather than chancing being captured on board the Nashville. And you have to realize that the United States and Great Britain had had a lot of diplomatic issues during the 1840s, all the way up to the 1859 Pig War. American fired a pig at the British in British Columbia. This is all over the concept of defining the border between the United States and Canada, as well as Westward Territory. Actually, they're trying to resolve where actually are the limits of Maine at that time. So I have to say, there's no love lost between Great Britain and America. Actually, the Union thought that the Confederates, there's no secrets in the Civil War. So the Federals all thought, oh my gosh, Slidell and Mason are going to go on board the Nashville, so we are going to capture it. And so they actually send a steamer known as the USS James Alger to capture it. And they miss, and so nothing happens. Now, when the war breaks out on May 13, 1861, Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister of England, gets permission from Queen Victoria to issue what is known as the Act of Neutrality. The Act of Neutrality is huge because it says, look, we're not going to help any belligerent in this war. We recognize the Confederacy as a belligerent. This drives the American ambassador to the court of St. James, Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, grandson of John Adams. So, he's come from a famous family. And so they file complaints. The British say, well, too bad. This is our stance. By the Act of Neutrality, and they also passed what's known as the Foreign Enlistment Act. In other words, they could repair ships for the Confederacy, even build ships ostensibly for the Confederacy, but they could not be warships. That cannon and so forth could not be sold directly to Confederate authorities. And so this becomes a big rigmarole. It also said no British citizen could serve in either army. And so we know there's a lot of fudging on that. But nevertheless, that Foreign Enlistment Act is extremely important. So here you have the Nashville, when it knows it can't, it doesn't need to take Slidell and Mason over, it will decide it has to actually run the blockade itself. And so as a result of that, October 21, 1861, the Nashville will slip out of the harbor, and Pigram will describe that actually you try to get going early. He ran aground. Oh my gosh. And as a result of running aground, he was losing the advantage of the early phases of darkness before the moon rose. Well, he gets off the bar. However, the moon rises, but he hides in what is known as the moon shadow. I don't know if anyone's old enough like me, but that was a song back when I was in college or something like that.
Hey,
So
John,
yes.
John, advance your slides.
Oh,
You
there's
might
the Harriet Lane.
you
Sorry.
might
Okay.
want to say
Okay.
a,
Okay.
a word or two about a couple of them. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is the Harry. I can kind of forget to show the slides. I should have them on automatic. I don't know. But this is the revenue cutter Harriet Lane, who fired the first naval shot of the Civil War. This is, of course, the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Actually, the Nashville comes in about 15 hours before this takes place. This is Robert Pegram in his U.S. Naval uniform. This is the Pig Point Battery. You see off in the distance the Harriet Lane shelling the batteries. This is, of course, James Mason of Virginia, a firebrand, if I ever knew of one, and an even equal firebrand was James Sidell. So these people are the envoys that the Federals don't want to get to Great Britain and France. Sidell is supposed to go to France. So anyway, this is Charles Francis Adams, who does his best to try and subvert the efforts for the Confederates to gain recognition, also to acquire military supplies, shipbuilding, and so forth from British shipbuilders and so forth. Now, what's going to happen is, now let me just tell you, October 21, the Nashville will run out of Charleston Harbor. Once again, the moon shadow saves them. So they go to Bermuda, St. George, Bermuda, where he will meet up with James Bullock, who is one of the Confederacy leading acquirer of material and so forth from Great Britain and France. So James Bullock is an outstanding person. He has bought an iron-hulled steamer, the CSS Fingal, which is filled with 10,000 rifled Enfield muskets and so forth. And so they meet there. Pigram gives a pilot to Bullock, and so then they part ways. Now, while all this is happening, I got to tell you that the first commerce raider was the CSS Sumter, and the Sumter had captured several ships off of Cuba. It just so happens, coming back from a duty slave patrol off the coast of Africa, is going to be this one person who, right there he is, Charles Wilkes. And Charles Wilkes is known as this great explorer. He actually went on an expedition, part of Antarctica, is named Wilkes Land in his honor. This guy is difficult to deal with. He court-martial you at the drop of a hat. Even though he was a really brilliant explorer, student of navigation, and really a proponent of new naval technologies, he was controversial, very difficult to work with, and extremely headstrong. And this picture kind of gives you that sense of what Wilkes is like. So Wilkes reached St. Thomas, the Virgin Islands, realizes that the Sumter is somewhere near Cuba. So what he'll do is go down to Cuba and try to figure out if the Sumter is still there. Instead, when he reaches Cuba, he learns that those two slippery Confederate envoys, Mason and Sidell, have landed in Cuba and that they're making their way so that they can get on board the RMS Trent. So this is really kind of amazing. So Wilkes decides, I'm going to go capture these people. You know, he doesn't have any qualms about it. He thinks they're the enemy. He doesn't care about Britain. In fact, they have a very anti-British feeling in the United States during this time. Consequently, Wilkes will stop the RMS Trent, which is against the laws of neutrality, etc. So he'll stop the Trent. He actually almost captures the vessel, but instead Sidell and Mason step forward, says, yeah, we're the guys. They, Wilkes takes them on board the San Jacinto, and then they go up to Hampton Roads and then to Boston Harbor, where the two envoys are imprisoned. in Fort Warren. Now, why do we want to talk about this? Well, let me just tell you, the news of the capture of Mason Sidel, the stopping of the Trent, reaches England, and it just so happens that it reaches England on the 19th of November, 1861. And this is the very same day as, guess what? The Pigram is about to arrive. It actually will arrive on the 21st of November, and en route, the Nashville is going to stop the Harvey Birch. The Harvey Birch is in Dallas, going from the Havre to New York. So they take all the prisoners and the passengers on board. They take all the nautical, navigational instruments, which are very critical. They're very expensive and rare during that time. And so once they take these people off the Harvey Birch, they set it afire. Whoa. So when Pigram arrives in Southampton, Great Britain, right? They will be treated like lions of the sea, so to speak. And actually, the British warships tip their flags as the Confederate ship comes in to the harbor. Now, this is a picture of the San Jacinto. This is the burning of the Harvey Birch. I have to say, there's a great colored version also, but it's copyrighted. But this was done by Courier and Ives. That's how shocking it is. So here we have the United States and Great Britain having these issues over the Act of Neutrality, Foreign Enlistment Act, the Trent Affair, and then shows up the Nashville. Now, the Nashville, as Pigram himself will write, that his ship enjoyed the distinction of being the first war vessel to fly the flag of the United States in the waters of England. And when he learned about the Trent Affair, that's right when he arrived, he lets off the 41 captured passengers and crew members of the Harvey Birch. And then he says, well, I thought it was a great probability of an early rupture between England and the United States, and I was determined to await the results. Now, he does at this time send a message to the then envoy to Great Britain from the Confederacy, a man known as William L. Yancey. He says, look, if you want to come back to the Confederacy with us, please do. Yancey says, oh, no, I don't want to do that. So basically, when they get to Southampton, they recognize that the Nashville, this is great. That's the Confederate flag there in Southampton Harbor. And right next door to it, believe it or not, is going to be that nasty boat known as the Tuscarora, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. So the Nashville needs repairs, so it's going to go into dock and going to be repaired. Now, the Foreign Enlistment Act says you can't do anything to strengthen the ship from a military stand of view. I have to tell you, the Nashville was not used to a North Atlantic crossing, so she suffered some damage going through these winter gales crossing, and consequently, they will need serious repairs. So Pigram goes ahead and has these repairs completed. Now, Adams yells and screams about the Foreign Enlistment Act, and so the Nashville actually only has these 6-pounder guns because her deck had not been strengthened to carry heavier armament. And the British wouldn't let the Nashville do that, but they got to coal, they got to clean out their boilers, they got to do everything they needed to have a proper overhaul. Now, while the trip over, I have to tell you, there's some more intrigue that Pigram noted that there were some of his crew members that weren't quite as patriotic as he thought they ought to be. So when the Nashville comes into Southampton, actually a fire is set on board the Nashville. They put it out. They can't find the perpetrators. However, a few days later, several deserters leave the ship, and Pegram says, so now we knew who were the disloyal. And so, but the Southampton gets all repaired. Now, the Federals, remember, we got the Trent Affair, Lord Russell, Foreign Minister of Great Britain, is trying to deal with William Seward, our Secretary of State. However, the United States send this ship, the Tuscarora, over to capture or destroy the Nashville. So, wow, this is really pretty critical. This is the commander of the Nashville right here. His name is Tunis Augustus McDonough Craven. Wow, what a name. He goes by T.A.M. Craven. Now, Craven had entered the U.S. Navy in 1829. He made it to lieutenant by 1841. And during the Mexican War, he will actually serve on board the USS Dale in the Pacific Squadron, and he will also be in the Gulf of California operating. So the U.S. Navy will actually charter a schooner named the Libertad, and Craven will become the commander of the Libertad. However, despite his bravery during the Mexican War, he's really not noted so much as a combat artist. He's noted as a member of the U.S. Coast Survey. He served for the U.S. Coast Survey for over 20 years of his career. So that makes him, quite a scholar of coast and so forth, of navigation. And so he is, at the outbreak of the war, given command of the cruiser Crusader in 1861, and he will be the man that saves Key West for the United States. Now, when he arrives on January 8th, 1862, he maintained a very close blockade, as you saw from a prior image, of the Nashville. So, what's going to happen is that Craven announces, and appears in the London Times, my intention was to await the egress of the Nashville and destroy that raider. Now, Pigram files a complaint against the Tuscarora with the Foreign Secretary of England and the Lords of Admiralty, saying, look, these guys, his ship's right next to mine. He's got his crew member all running around. They're really violating the Act of Neutrality. And so, the Admiralty will warn the sloop's commander, Tunis Craven, not to violate the neutrality laws and avoid any conflict, that they instituted what is called the 24-hour rule. Now, by this time, the end of January, the Trent Affair had been cooled down thanks to the efforts of Lord Russell and William Seward, but nevertheless, there's a great deal of amity between the two nations. And so this is a great cartoon that's Lord Russell. And notice he looks at the Tuscarora, which on the left, saying, oh, you can't go anywhere. You have to wait 24 hours until the other belligerent ship leaves. And how do we say who gets the first start? It was said by the Lords of the Admiralty, whoever trips their anchor first. And so the Nashville will be able to actually leave Southampton on February 3rd. And the British, here's the Nashville. This is the HMS Shannon. Let me tell you about this. So when all this is happening, the British don't trust Craven, and he's not to be trusted in their opinion. So they send this frigate, it's a steam screw frigate, known as the HMS Shannon. And I have to tell you, what would be really neat is that when they left, the Shannon is anchored virtually alongside the Tuscarora, with his gun, according to Pigram, with his gun shotted and its steam up as a way to say to Tuscarora, you ain't going nowhere. So, and it was said by Pigram to prevent any breach of faith. The English frigate, HMS Shannon, was alongside the Federal vessel. So this was pretty good. So the Nashville is going to make its escape. We're going to deal with this story later because that's going to be the Robert Gilfin, which will be destroyed by the Nashville later. So the Nashville gets out of Great Britain. They're able to then go all the way down to Bermuda, St. George again. They reach there on February 20th. Attain coal. They get a pilot to go into Beaufort, North Carolina. Now, en route, they spot this schooner, right? The Robert Gilfin, and they will stop it. It has all these provisions, but the sea is too rough. So they take the crew members off and they burn the vessel. So the Nashville has actually 2 victims to its credit by this time. Merchant ship was set ablaze and Nashville steamed on towards Bermuda. Now at dawn on the 28th of February, the Nashville is nearing the entrance to Bogue Sound, which is defended by a coastal defense fort known as Fort Macon. Well, I got to tell you that there is one blockader watching the entrance, and that is the USS State of Georgia, commanded by Commander James Armstrong. Now, just like the master of the Robert Gilfin thought, Armstrong thought that the Nashville was actually the steamer USS Keystone State. And because they looked alike. In fact, Gilfin, the commander of the Gilfin, will note that as ship approached, Pigram's flying the American flag, and then he sends John Ingram on board the schooner. Check its paper. The commander of the schooner is boasting about Federal victories, and Ingram sends a message back to Pigram, and he tells the commander of the Robert Gilfin that, you're captured by the steamer CSS Nashville. In that moment, all the Confederate flags go up on the ship, and so little note of surprise. Now, Pigram is going, so, here's the main channel, and so the state of Georgia has to be out here to block any entrance to the channel. So what Pigram does is he says, okay, I fooled one person one time. So he flies the American flag, comes in towards the channel like this is just what I like to do. And all of a sudden, as he passes by the state of Georgia, he then drops the American flag and raises 2 Confederate flags. And let me just get to, there it is. That's a flag from the Nashville, believe it or not. And the Mariners Museum received it from a descendant of James Bullock and James Bullock's brother, Irvine Bullock. And it just so happens that Irvine Bullock was on board the Nashville. And basically, Bullock is the uncle to Theodore Roosevelt. So it's pretty amazing. So anyway, I want to show you that flag. Look how unique it is. It just has 7 stars. So it's a very early Confederate flag. So nevertheless, So as he passes the state of Georgia, up go the Confederate flags. And Pigram will say, as I passed her, I ordered the United States flag to be hauled down and hoisted the Confederate flag at the foremost head at the peak, while my pendant was run up on the main. Now, Armstrong, as the Nashville, aka the Keystone State, rushes by, all right, the blockader, the Armstrong, will fire, actually, it turns out to be 21 shots at the Nashville. And he can't chase the Nashville because it can come under the guns of Fort Macon. So Pigram will say that, oh, they all missed. And he will then note, I answered the enemy salute by firing one gun, finding it useless to waste more powder. As the Nashville pass, it will go past Fort Macon and then dock at what is known as Morehead City, North Carolina. Oh my gosh. So here they are. They have great fame. They stubbed their nose diplomatically at the United States with the support of Great Britain. Nashville's captured 2 ships. And so it is a very famous ship, and the Federals all want to destroy it. So Pigram, when he arrives, he will immediately go up to Richmond by rail. He meets with Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy, Stephen Russell Mallory. And Mallory says, well, look, Fraser Trenholm and Company of Charleston and of Liverpool have bought the vessel, and they want to turn it into a blockade runner. So you need to make sure it gets turned over to them. Pigram says, yes, sir. Robert Pegram comes back down via rail, and the rail goes all the way down to New Bern and then goes down to Morehead City. Well, I have to tell you, Pigram says, okay, we're going to take all our sailors and so forth off the ship, leave a skeleton crew. We're going to take all the charts. We're going to take all the nautical instruments, and that's Confederate property. They even took the 2 6-pounders. And then Pigram gets on the last train to leave Morehead City, because you got to realize when all this is happening, yes, indeed, then Brigadier General Ambrose Everett Burnside will have won the Battle of actually New Bern. And as a result of this victory on March 14th, 1862, Morehead City is isolated. And so Pigram, when he leaves, he places in command. Let me get to this guy. There he is. He's big in our story, William Conway Whittle. And Whittle, his father is William Conway Whittle Sr., a great naval officer from the War of 1812, Mexican War, and so forth. And Whittle, this is his son, born in 1841 in Norfolk, Virginia. He will graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1858 and briefly serves in the U.S. Navy, but then joins the Virginia State Navy and then becomes an officer within the Confederate Navy. He will be named as, well, first he serves in water batteries. I already explained why these naval officers are in water batteries, because they're used to operating heavy guns. And so basically, he then will be named 3rd Lieutenant of the Nashville. So when Pigram leaves, he leaves Whittle in charge. He says, well, you've got to get it to Fraser Trenholm and Company somehow. So now Whittle is going to be in kind of a, that's the Keystone State, by the way, what is confused for the Nashville. So actually, Whittle gets his ship ready to be demolished, but he decides that I need to make a break. So he goes up near Fort Macon, and this is at the very tip of Bogue Bank. On the other side of the entrance was very narrow. I don't know how many people have been there, is Shackelford Bank. And so he meets with the commander of Fort Macon, a man known as Colonel Moses White. And Moses White is a graduate of the College of William and Mary and an 1859 graduate of West Point. He will suffer from epilepsy and die in 1863. But he's there then. And so actually he talks with Pigram and says, look, you might as well destroy your vessel. There's not much we can do. We really can't cover you with our guns effectively, and I could use your men to help us defend Fort Macon. Actually, good old Whittle will say, well, no, I want to give it a chance, and I'm going to break out tonight. And he decides, and that night is going to be March 17, 1862. And so his plan is to try to bypass their 3 blockaders there. And as Whittle himself wrote in 1910, steaming towards the bar, I found 3 vessels congregated close together, underway and covering the close channel. We were going at full speed, the blockaders underway and broadside to me were across my path. I ran for the furthest to the northward and eastward with the determination to go through or sink both ships, i.e. one of the blockaders or his own ship. However, for some odd reason, he was given the right of way and passed through heavy fire, he says. And this is a really big problem for the Union. I have to tell you, this is a cartoon by Currier and Ives, I think is fabulous. You can see the Nashville. There's good old Whittle thumbing his nose at the Jumbo and the Cambridge. You see, you got to remember, the U.S. says the Union says we're going to have a blockade of the southern coastline in April of 1861. They don't have the ships to do so. So they rent, lease, and buy a whole series of ships. Some of them are virtually worthless. Some of them are ferry boats and so forth. But they cannot match what the Nashville has in speed and so forth. And so these little captions right here are pretty nice. Shiver, as one man in the Gembuck says, shiver my timbers, my hearty, but it would have been a darn sight better to have put us in a decent ship and sent us here to catch. Well, another person said, or one of the other, that one right there, says the only way to capture that ship, the Nashville, is to get Morgan, J.P. Morgan, to buy her. So, oh my gosh, that pretty well tells you what is happening. So anyway, the Nashville then plotted a course towards what is called Charleston, and there are all these blockaders there. So he turns around and tries to make it into Whittle Bay, South Carolina, which leads to the port of Georgetown. Now, Whittle doesn't know anything about the shoreline and so forth, so his ship runs aground. The Federals, the Confederates who are there, are along the shoreline. They're having patrol. They ride up and they shout to the Nashville, "Who are you?" And Whittle shouts back, "This is the Confederate State steamer, the Nashville." The soldiers couldn't believe what they heard, and so they doubted it. So they took Whittle to meet with Arthur Middleton Magagalt, who later becomes a brigadier general. He is commander of the 1st Military District of South Carolina, headquartered in Georgetown. And basically, he will say, well, yeah, I'll get you some pilots. And so this painting sometimes is referred to as the Nashville coming into Beaufort or Bogue, Bogue Sound, but there's no Fort Macon there. And they did have some ships that came out to help with the Nashville coming in. So this is actually it entering into the Wythe Bay and heading towards Georgetown. This, the Mariners Museum, this is part of our collection. That Confederate flag. I remember when I first held it, it was like, oh my gosh. So anyway, so Whittle goes to Georgetown. He docks the vessel. He then goes down to Charleston, say, here you go. You've got the ship. The vessel is going to then serve as the Thomas L. Rag, as I told you, and then later as the privateer Rattlesnake. And we're going to talk about that. I think I have a lecture about the Montauk in January sometime. I can't really remember, but I want to remind you all, Nashville is a unique ship. The steamer received the first naval fire during the Civil War. It was the first commerce raider to serve in the North Atlantic. It was the first Confederate warship to be recognized by Great Britain. Although this paddler was poorly armed, it was extremely fast, and it enabled the Nashville to run the blockade 5 times. The warship was a symbol of the fledgling Confederate Navy's efforts to gain recognition from a foreign power. So that's the story of the CSS Nashville. And if you have any questions or comments, you can make them to me now, okay? Or send me an email.
Thank you, John. You're talking about God's country here. I'm a Morehead City native.
I know that.
Fort Macon is one of my favorite places in the world. So I encourage any of you that haven't been to the promised land, as we call it, do go. We do have a couple of questions. Michael is asking, does the beam include the paddle housing, or is beam just the width of the hull?
The width of the hull. They call them paddle boxes, actually, and so that's not considered part of the beam. That's the breadth of the width of the deck.
Okay. And another viewer is asking that you said the Nashville was built as a screw steamer.
I meant a paddler.
Okay, so he says the drawing showed a sidewheeler. So it's
that was my rush to try and get the story out.
Okay.
It is the engines are made by Novelty Ironworks. If you read the blog, I go into detail about it. But no, it was a paddler, which actually made it so fast. And its whole design was to run this mail route as a packet. So when you think about 14.5 knots, and you think of the Monitor going 7. You realize that the Nashville was indeed a very fast steamer. So it was a paddler sidewheeler.
How large is the Storm Flag in the collection?
Oh my gosh, if I remember it well, it is about a little over a yard in length, and maybe I don't know, 1.5 feet in width. Okay. It is a small flag. Yeah, I mean, it's the real deal. Let me tell you, because we got it from a descendant of Theodore Roosevelt, and he got it from the Bullock side of Roosevelt's family. Roosevelt's mother was a Bullock from Savannah, Georgia. Yes, it's really unique. It could be considered a storm flag as well. The statement by Pigram saying it was, he hoisted the Confederate flag, yet another Confederate flag than his pendant, could have been that this smaller flag was utilized as that. I don't think, unless they're using a cutter in Southampton, England, Great Britain, they would have really used a small boat flag. So, but we don't know. The museum was very fortunate that we received all sorts of bullock items, which include the flag of the CSS Alabama, the shipbuilding model. I think we showed that in our program about the sinking of the Hatteras, but I'm going to do another program about the Alabama, so I complete the trilogy of those stories. It's hard keeping up. Next week, I'm going to be talking about the Spanish flu, which I thought was very appropriate to talk about now. It would have been in 1918, 102 years ago, in its second phase, the most deadly of all of its phases. It seems like that virus kind of mutated. And actually, if you didn't wear a mask, you got a $5 fine in some cities. And so I just like to say, and they didn't know germs or anything back then. In fact, some doctors still bled people. So, you know, we hadn't really gotten into modern medicine yet. And but the Red Cross nurses figured out how to have a double gauze mask, and so that's what everyone was using. So anyway,
We have a few more questions.
okay.
Whatever happened to Lieutenant Whittle?
Oh my gosh, I was going to save those stories for later.
Oh.
So anyway, but I'll tell you all about it. Whittle is going to be assigned to the European squadron. You know, they had a bunch of officers in being in Paris as well as in London, waiting for the ships that Bullock was acquiring, like the, let's talk about it, the Alabama, the Shenandoah. So he gets to Paris in late 1863. He's waiting orders when the Alabama docks in Cherbourg. Whittle rushes to Cherbourg to try and join the crew of the Alabama. The French authorities wouldn't let him, and as a result of that, he is not part of the sinking of the Alabama. However, he's going to be named the executive officer of the CSS Shenandoah. So Whittle has the great distinction of circumventing the globe and the only Confederate ship, the Shenandoah. I'm going to give a program about the Shenandoah, but just remember it sank all sorts of whalers up in the Bering Sea. You go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, they said, we lost our whaling industry all because of the Nashville. And so he will sail with it along with Irvine Bullock, who was then the sailing master of the Shenandoah, and they will take their ship under the command of James Waddell all the way up to, they will surrender, or they haul down the Confederate flag. I think it's November 3rd, 1865. So anyway, the Shenandoah is credited with firing the last shots of the Civil War and dealing with the whaling fleet up in the Arctic.
Couple more questions.
Okay.
Was it considered honorable for the Nashville to sneak in under the Union flag and then change to the Confederate flag?
Well, that's a good question. Commerce raiders have to be slick, and you know the Alabama did it, the Nashville did it, I think the Rappahannock did it, but it was just a ploy to get close. It was a life and death decision. So do you choose to use trickery, as I wrote in my blog, versus let me just go at them? Now, Pigram had fooled Armstrong well enough by the appearance of the Nashville looking like the Keystone State that he really didn't have to put that flag up. But what he did when he comes abreast of the state of Georgia, he will actually lower the U.S. flag, fly the Confederate flag. So boom, the Federals now know who you are and you can fire at them. It's just like Armstrong men on the state of Georgia have not been practicing their guns very well. So anyway, so I think that borders on dishonesty, to tell you the truth. I think if I had been Pegram, I'd flown that flag myself. Yeah, when actually they come into Georgetown, they have all their Confederate flags flying. And the soldier says, "Do you have any other flag?" "Well, we have a U.S. flag, but we don't want to fly it now. We want to fly our Confederate flags, Because Whittle at first thinks they could be Union soldiers, because remember, he knew all about the capture of New Bern, Morehead City, Beaufort, Beaufort. And so he knew everything was at risk. So I don't know. I guess I'd like to get an opinion from a lawyer, a nautical lawyer, about
Maritime
the
law.
rules. Yeah, maritime law, because I'm just not sure.
Well, I have a question about the 24-hour rule. How often was that put in place?
One time.
One time.
One time.
Huh.
Only there was, now there are cruisers waiting ships like, when they're building hull 290, everybody knows that's going to become the Alabama, that is a Confederate ship. And so the Federals actually have ships there kind of cruising nearby just in case.
Huh.
But when it comes out, it will be flying the British flag. It's still a British ship until it makes it to the Azores, and then they'll meet up with a supply ship and put guns on and commission it as the CSS Alabama. They do the same thing with the Shenandoah, the Florida, Rappahannock, Georgia. So yeah, the best where to get ships is going to be in Europe. And that was part of Stephen Russell Mallory's plan when she realized, see, the Confederates almost had the sufficient ironclads to hold the Mississippi. They run out of time to build them, and the ships weren't that good. So Mallory knew they were defensive ships, and Mallory knew the only way to have a way to break the blockade, you couldn't do them with home-built ironclads, but you surely could do it with English ironclads. And so they try to build several ironclads in England. Eventually, the subterfuge will be uncovered. And then they do actually build one in France, which is discovered. It's going to go to the Confederacy. So the French then sell it to the Danes. The Danes use it for a little while, stadtholder. Then they sell it to the Confederacy. Confederacy call it, "Oh my gosh, we got the Stonewall." Then they get to, America waters too late. They sell it to the Spanish officials. America buys it back for them. Then they sell it to the Japanese during the Meiji Restoration in 1868. I'll give that lecture some other time. It's neater than what I'm saying.
Yes, you're going to talk about that next spring, I think.
I don't know. I know what I'm talking about today.
Good.
And
you did well.
Thanks.
Two more questions.
Okay.
Was the revenue cutter Harriet Lane under U.S. Navy control at Fort Sumter in 1861?
No, it was not. It is not taken over by the Navy until probably mid-May 1861, because it is a fast steamer and very, very effective for work, because it's a revenue cutter in shallow waters. So by the time it's going to exchange fire with the Pig Point batteries on May 18, 1861, it's already a U.S. Navy ship. So that, and so it was a U.S. Navy ship when it gets captured. The Harriet Lane starts as a Coast Revenue cutter. It starts as a U.S. Navy ship, and then it becomes a Confederate ship. So it changes hands quite a bit.
Well, one last question comment. Lauren says, fascinating story, which we certainly agree. Any recommended books that cover this subject well? So, Mr. Korstein, have you written about the Nashville ever?
I've written a little bit about it. I think it's a J. Thomas Campbell wrote some books about all of the commerce raiders maybe 20 years ago.
Mhm.
I can't remember the title right now. I remember the author, and because I knew him, and so no, it's such a fascinating story, and there's been several books written about the Shenandoah, numerous books written about the Alabama, but even Thomas Campbell did not include ships like the Georgia and the Rappahannock and some of the problems they have with that. The whole story of how the Confederates tried to acquire ships overseas and their impact on the war is really a topic that hasn't been really delved into with enough depth to make it a real scholarly volume. I'm kind of caught up in writing a couple of other things right now. I'm trying to finish my Nat Turner book, and I'm writing a biography about Admiral Worden, which I'm going to feature part of that book in January. January 8th. Oh my God, I better get to work.
January 8th will be Worden and the Montauk.
Okay, it's a great story, trust me. And it's going to end at what is called Fort McAllister, the sinking of the Rattlesnake, only because that's a big story in itself. And Worden is also going to be there in a critical role, which I'll write a blog and give a lecture about during DuPont's ironclad attack on Charleston. So that's a big topic. This was a big topic. Word in the Montauk's a big topic. I don't know. I could talk for hours about it.
Well, we hope you all will join us next Friday for the Spanish flu, virtually, thank goodness. And then on December 18th, John will close out the banner year 2020 with the last days of USS Monitor. So
Right.
we do hope you will join us and watch on YouTube and read our blogs and buy John's books from the Mariners Museum gift shop. You can order them online, and they're signed by John. And we thank all of you for coming today and hope we'll see you next time.
Yes, I just want to remind you all, sink before surrender. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.